I was sitting at my kitchen table, addressing wedding invitations to my garden club friends when my phone rang. The moment I heard Daniel's voice, I started to tell him how excited I was about the ceremony. But before I could finish my sentence, he cut me off. His voice was strained, apologetic, but firm. Brittany had decided I couldn't come to the wedding. She said I made her uncomfortable, that I was too controlling, and their special day needed to be drama-free. The phone nearly slipped from my hand. 43 years of motherhood, erased from his wedding day. I stood there in my kitchen, tears streaming down my face, unable to process what I'd just heard. My only child, the boy I'd raised alone after his father died 8 years ago, was getting married without me. I tried to ask Daniel what I'd done wrong, my voice breaking as I spoke. He hesitated, then said Brittany had a list of grievances. A list. He promised to send it via email and hung up quickly, leaving me standing there with the phone still pressed to my ear. That evening, I sat down at my computer with a cup of tea, trying to calm my nerves. When the email arrived, I opened it with shaking hands. 3 pages. Brittany had typed 3 full pages of complaints about me. I read through them slowly, my confusion growing with each paragraph. According to her list, I'd committed terrible offenses. When I told her wedding dress choice was interesting, she interpreted it as veiled criticism. When I offered to help with flower arrangements, she saw it as me trying to take over her wedding. When I asked about her family history, she felt I was prying into her background inappropriately. When I mentioned Daniel's childhood summers at the cabin, she believed I was deliberately making her feel excluded from our family history. I read the list 3 times, trying to understand. Every normal conversation we'd had, every casual interaction, had been documented and twisted into something sinister. I thought about the dress comment. I genuinely found her choice interesting because it was different from traditional styles. The flowers? I was a retired elementary school teacher who'd coordinated dozens of school events. I was just trying to be helpful. Her family? I was making conversation, trying to get to know her. The cabin stories? I was sharing happy memories, trying to include her in our family traditions. But somehow, all of it had become evidence of my supposed manipulation and control. I spent hours that night crafting a careful response. I chose every word deliberately, making sure nothing could be misinterpreted. I expressed my love for both of them. I apologized for any misunderstandings, even though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for. I suggested we meet for coffee to clear the air face to face. I told them how much I wanted to be part of their happiness. I mentioned how special the cabin was to our family, and how excited I was that they'd chosen to marry there, in the place where Daniel had spent every summer of his childhood. I hit send at 11:30 that night, praying it would fix things. The next day, I was in my garden pulling weeds when I heard a car door slam in my driveway. I looked up to see Daniel walking toward me, and my heart lifted for a moment. But then, I saw his face. He was angry. Not upset or frustrated, but genuinely angry in a way I'd rarely seen. He didn't even say hello. He just started talking, his voice tight and controlled. My email had proved Brittany's point, he said. She'd shown it to her family, and they all agreed I was gaslighting her. Her mother, Helen, had called me toxic and narcissistic. Daniel accused me of playing the victim, of manipulating the situation to make myself look innocent. Then he dropped the real bomb. Brittany had declared that if I was mentioned at the wedding at all, in any capacity, she would cancel everything. And Daniel was demanding that I not contact him until after their honeymoon. 4 months. 4 months of silence, imposed like a punishment. I tried to speak, tried to explain, but he was already walking back to his car. He got in and drove away without looking back, leaving me standing in my garden with dirt on my hands and tears on my face. I'd tried to fix things, tried to be reasonable and loving, and somehow my attempt had made everything catastrophically worse. I wasn't just uninvited to the wedding now. I was persona non grata, forbidden from even mentioning it. My son, the boy I'd rocked to sleep and nursed through chickenpox and taught to ride a bike, had just walked away from me like I was a stranger. No, worse than a stranger, like I was a threat. The week after Daniel left, I felt like I was walking through fog. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep properly. I kept replaying every interaction I'd had with Brittany, trying to find the moment where everything went wrong. Finally, I decided to call my sister Patricia. She'd always been my closest confidant, the person I turned to when life got hard. But when Patricia answered the phone, her voice was cold, distant, like she was talking to someone she barely knew. I asked her if we could meet for lunch, said I really needed to talk. There was a long pause. Then she said she didn't want to get involved in drama. My stomach dropped. Drama? I asked her what she meant. That's when she told me Brittany had been in touch with the extended family for months. Not just recently, but months ago, long before the wedding invitation issue. Brittany had been sharing concerns about my behavior, painting a picture of an overbearing, jealous mother-in-law who couldn't let her son grow up. I felt like the ground was falling away beneath me. I asked Patricia why she hadn't told me. She said she'd thought it was just normal wedding stress at first, but now, with everything that was happening, she wasn't sure what to believe anymore. After I hung up with Patricia, I sat in my living room for an hour, staring at nothing. Then I picked up the phone again and called my nephew James. He was Daniel's cousin, only 2 years younger, and they'd grown up together like brothers. If anyone would understand, it would be James. But James was uncomfortable the moment he heard my voice. He admitted that Brittany had contacted him 3 months ago. She'd reached out on social media, very friendly and casual at first. Then she'd started sharing her concerns about me. She'd told him I was having trouble accepting Daniel's relationship, that I was trying to sabotage their happiness. She'd asked James to watch for signs of my manipulation when we were all together at family gatherings. James said he'd defended me at first, but then, he said, recent events seemed to confirm Brittany's concerns. The fact that I'd tried to contact family members, that I'd sent that email, that I was making such a big deal about the wedding invitation, it all seemed to fit the pattern Brittany had described. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Brittany had spent months laying groundwork, preparing everyone to see me as the villain. And it had worked. Over the next few days, I learned that other relatives had received similar messages. Brittany had been systematic and thorough. She'd reached out to aunts, uncles, cousins, even family friends. She'd never said anything directly cruel about me. Instead, she'd expressed worry and concern. She'd asked for their understanding and support. She'd positioned herself as the reasonable one, trying to deal with a difficult situation. Then my friend Carol showed me something that made my blood run cold. She pulled up Facebook on her phone and showed me Brittany's posts from the past few months. They were vague, but pointed. Posts about setting boundaries with toxic family members. Posts about how hard it is to stand up to people who use guilt and manipulation. Posts about choosing your own happiness over other people's expectations. Brittany never mentioned my name. She was too smart for that. But the context was clear, especially to people who knew about the wedding, and the comments section was full of supportive messages. Friends praising her strength, extended family members liking her posts, even some of Daniel's relatives commenting with heart emojis and encouraging words. I felt sick. She'd created a public narrative where she was the brave woman standing up to abuse, and I was the unnamed villain everyone could imagine. Anyone who saw those posts would think she was dealing with something terrible. And if they later heard I'd been uninvited from the wedding, it would seem completely justified. I couldn't let this stand. I spent 2 days creating a detailed timeline of actual events. I wrote down every interaction I could remember with Brittany, exactly what was said and when. I wrote a letter to my family explaining my side, asking them to remember who I really was, who I'd always been. I included specific examples of times we'd been there for each other, reminded them of my character and history. I sent the letter to Patricia, to James, and to a few other close relatives. I asked them to please just read it with an open mind. To remember that there are always two sides to every story. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Daniel, calling from a blocked number. I answered, hopeful that maybe my letter had helped, that maybe someone had talked to him. But he was furious. More furious than I'd ever heard him. I'd violated his boundary of no contact, he said. I was harassing the family. Brittany was having panic attacks because of me. She'd had to take time off work because the stress was affecting her health. And now she was threatening to postpone the wedding if I continued this behavior. Then he said something that cut deeper than anything else. His voice was cold and certain. Maybe I never really knew you, Mom. Brittany helped me see patterns I was blind to my whole life. I tried to speak, but he kept going. They were considering a restraining order if I contacted them or any family member again about this situation. He said I needed professional help. He said I was unwell. Before he hung up, he mentioned something that made me go very still. He said Brittany's family lawyer was looking into the cabin situation anyway, so I shouldn't think I could use that as leverage. The cabin? Why would a lawyer be looking into the cabin? I sat there after he hung up, trying to understand. The cabin had been in our family for 40 years. Gerald, my late husband, had built it with his own hands, with help from his mother. We'd spent every summer there when Daniel was growing up. It was where he'd learned to swim, where we'd had countless barbecues and bonfires, where our family had created a lifetime of memories. What did Brittany's lawyer want with the cabin? And that's when a terrible thought occurred to me. Did they think they owned it? Did Daniel assume he'd inherited it? I'd always planned to leave it to him in my will, of course. But I'd never actually discussed the ownership details with him. After Gerald died, I just kept paying the property taxes and maintaining it. I'd assumed Daniel understood it was still mine, that it would be his someday, but not yet. Had Brittany convinced Daniel that it was already his? Was that what this was really about? I felt completely isolated. My attempt to defend myself had been used as evidence against me. My family believed I was the problem. I was facing a possible restraining order. And now there was something happening with the cabin, something legal, something I didn't understand. Every solution I'd tried had made things worse. Every step I'd taken had led me deeper into this nightmare. I was alone, and I was losing everything. 2 weeks later, a certified letter arrived at my house. I signed for it with a sense of dread, knowing it couldn't be good news. Inside was correspondence from an attorney named Gregory Walsh, representing Daniel and Brittany. The letter was formal and cold. It stated that Daniel and Brittany planned to take primary residence at the cabin after their wedding. It requested that I remove all personal belongings within 30 days. It referred to Daniel as the rightful heir to the property and demanded I provide documentation of any ownership claims I believed I had. The letter used legal terms I didn't fully understand: adverse possession, estate irregularities, beneficiary rights. It made the cabin sound like disputed territory instead of my home. I read the letter 5 times, my hands shaking more with each reading. They weren't asking to visit the cabin or share it. They were telling me to get out. They believed it was theirs, and they wanted me gone. I thought about the cabin, about what it meant to our family. Gerald had purchased the land in 1985 when Daniel was just a baby. It was a beautiful piece of property on a lake in the Adirondacks, 3 hours north of our town. Gerald's mother, Iris, had helped with the down payment. She'd been a widow with some money saved, and she'd wanted to help her son give his family something special. Gerald had spent 3 summers building that cabin, working on weekends and vacations. I'd been there with him, pregnant with Daniel at first, then with a toddler running around, while Gerald hammered and sawed and built our dream. It was modest. Just 3 bedrooms and a big open living area with a stone fireplace, but it was beautiful. It sat on 2 acres of wooded land with 300 feet of lake frontage. We'd paid the mortgage for 20 years, every month, without fail, even when money was tight. We'd finally paid it off 5 years before Gerald died. I remembered the celebration we'd had, the 3 of us at the cabin, burning the mortgage papers in the fireplace and toasting with champagne. After Gerald died, I'd kept the cabin maintained. I'd paid the property taxes every year, had the septic system serviced, replaced the roof 2 years ago. It cost me about $8,000 a year to maintain, which was a strain on my teacher's pension and Social Security, but I'd done it because it was our family place. Daniel's inheritance, eventually. But I'd never actually discussed the specifics of ownership with Daniel. I'd assumed he understood the situation. His father had died. The cabin was mine now, and someday it would be his. That's how these things worked, wasn't it? Apparently, Daniel had different assumptions. And Brittany had built an entire plan around those assumptions. I called my attorney, Martin Fletcher. He'd been a friend of Gerald's and had handled the estate when my husband died. He was semi-retired now, only taking a few clients, but he agreed to see me right away. In his office, I showed him the letter from Gregory Walsh. Martin read it carefully, his expression darkening. Then he asked to see my property documents. I'd brought everything I could find, a folder of papers I'd kept in my filing cabinet but rarely looked at. Martin spread the documents across his desk and studied them. After about 20 minutes, he looked up at me. "The cabin is yours, Claudine, entirely yours. Has been since Gerald died." I felt a wave of relief, but also confusion. Then why are they claiming Daniel is the rightful heir? Martin explained that Gerald's will had mentioned the cabin. It had said something like all property, including the family cabin, to pass, according to legal ownership structures. That phrase was vague, Martin admitted. If someone didn't understand property law, they might read it as the cabin going to Daniel. But the actual ownership superseded the will because of how the deed was structured. He advised me to send clear documentation to Gregory Walsh, showing the chain of ownership, make it official and legal. Show them there's no ambiguity here. I agreed. Martin drafted a careful letter explaining the ownership situation. He attached copies of the property deed, tax records showing me as the sole taxpayer for 8 years, and relevant portions of Gerald's estate documents. The letter was polite but firm. It stated the facts clearly and offered to answer any questions. I signed it, and Martin sent it via certified mail to Gregory Walsh's office. 3 days later, I got a call from my bank. The woman on the phone sounded concerned. She said there had been significant activity on my checking account and wanted to verify it was legitimate. My stomach dropped. What kind of activity? She explained that someone had withdrawn all but $50 from my account that morning. $12,317 gone in a single transaction. I told her I hadn't authorized any withdrawal. She pulled up the details. The withdrawal had been made by Daniel Hartwell, who was listed as a joint account holder. I'd forgotten about that. 8 years ago, right after Gerald died, I'd added Daniel to my checking account. I'd been overwhelmed with grief and worried about what would happen if something happened to me. The bank had suggested having someone else on the account for emergencies. Daniel had been the obvious choice. He was my son, my only family. I'd trusted him completely. We'd never talked about it again. The account had always been functionally mine. Daniel had never used it, never even mentioned it. I'd assumed he'd forgotten it existed. But now, he'd drained it. $12,000, most of which was my savings. Money I'd carefully set aside from my pension over the years for emergencies, for home repairs, for security. I drove straight to the bank, hoping there was some mistake. But there was no mistake. Daniel had walked in that morning with identification and withdrawn the money. He had legal right to do so as a joint account holder. The bank couldn't reverse it. When I got home, there was an email waiting for me from Gregory Walsh. The subject line was, "Cease and desist." The email accused me of attempted property theft. It claimed the documents I'd sent were potentially fraudulent and that they would be investigating their authenticity. It stated that Daniel had withdrawn his money from our joint account because I was proving untrustworthy. It threatened litigation if I didn't cease and desist from making false claims about the cabin. I couldn't breathe. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the email, trying to understand how this had happened. I'd tried to clarify the ownership situation, to show them the truth. And instead, I'd been accused of fraud. I'd lost my savings. I was being threatened with lawsuits. Every solution created a worse problem. Every attempt to fix things pushed me deeper into crisis. That night, I barely slept. I kept thinking about the $12,000. It wasn't a fortune, but it was everything I had beyond my monthly pension. It was my security, my cushion against disaster. And now, it was gone. Daniel had taken it. My son had walked into a bank and taken my money. Not because he needed it, he had a good job as an engineer, but because Brittany had convinced him I was untrustworthy. Or maybe because Brittany wanted to punish me. Or maybe just because they could. I thought about getting a lawyer, fighting back, demanding the money be returned. But Martin had already warned me that would be expensive. Legal battles cost money I didn't have anymore, and it would make things worse with Daniel, push us further apart. I was trapped, financially vulnerable, legally threatened, emotionally devastated, and completely alone. In the weeks that followed, I withdrew into myself. I stopped answering my phone unless I recognized the number. I avoided places where I might run into people who knew Daniel and Brittany. I felt like everyone was looking at me, judging me, believing I was the toxic mother the internet posts described. But something kept nagging at me. Why would Brittany work so hard to isolate me? Why go to such lengths to turn everyone against me? Yes, she wanted the cabin, but this level of manipulation seemed excessive. There was something more going on, something I was missing. 1 month before the wedding, I made a decision. I needed to know who Brittany really was. Not the version she presented to Daniel, but her actual history. I called Thomas Bradley. He'd been Gerald's best friend since college. After Gerald died, Thomas had checked on me regularly, made sure I was doing okay. He was a retired private investigator who'd worked for a firm in the city for 30 years. If anyone could help me, it was Thomas. I drove to his house and explained the situation. I told him everything, the whole terrible story. Then, I asked him to look into Brittany's background. Past relationships, financial situation, any legal issues. I needed to know if my instincts about her were right. Thomas was hesitant. He said it felt wrong to investigate Daniel's fiancée. But I reminded him of his promise to Gerald, to look after me. Finally, he agreed. He said it would take a couple of weeks. While I waited, life got worse. I went to church the Sunday after meeting with Thomas. I'd been attending the same church for 30 years, was part of the women's group, helped organize community meals and charity drives. It was one of my anchors, one place I thought I'd still be welcome. But when I arrived, several women I'd known for decades were cold to me. They said hello, but barely, and didn't invite me to sit with them. At coffee hour after the service, I overheard 2 of them talking about someone who was having mental health issues and wouldn't accept help. They stopped talking when they saw me. I approached Martha, one of my oldest friends in the congregation. I asked her directly what was going on. She looked uncomfortable, then pulled me aside. She told me Brittany had visited the church 3 weeks ago. She'd met with the pastor and several women's group leaders. She'd expressed private concerns about me, said the family was worried about my mental health, suggested I might be having trouble accepting Daniel's independence. Brittany had described me as a lonely widow who couldn't let go, who was becoming increasingly erratic. She'd asked the church community to keep an eye on me, to gently encourage me to seek help if they noticed concerning behavior. I felt humiliated. Brittany had poisoned even my church community, and she'd done it so carefully, with such apparent concern, that people believed her. The pastor pulled me aside after I talked to Martha. He was kind, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He gently suggested I might benefit from grief counseling. He mentioned that Daniel had also reached out to him, expressing concerns about me living alone. He said the church wanted to support me, but I needed to be willing to accept help. I tried to explain that I didn't need help, that this was all a misunderstanding, but even as I said it, I heard how defensive I sounded. I realized that anything I said would be interpreted through Brittany's narrative. If I was calm, I was in denial. If I was upset, I was unstable. If I defended myself, I was refusing to accept reality. I left church that day knowing I couldn't go back. Not because I didn't want to, but because staying would mean submitting to Brittany's version of who I was. And I couldn't do that. That evening, Thomas called me, but what he said made everything worse, not better. "Daniel wants to talk to you," he said. "He's here with me." My heart leaped. Maybe Daniel had come to his senses. Maybe Thomas had talked to him, made him see reason. I asked Thomas to put him on the phone. But when Daniel spoke, his voice was angry. "You hired an investigator to dig up dirt on Brittany? How could you?" I froze. Thomas had told him. Thomas, my late husband's best friend, had betrayed me. Daniel ranted about invasion of privacy, about my desperate attempts to sabotage his relationship, about how this proved everything Brittany had said about me. Then Thomas got back on the phone. He sounded apologetic but firm. "Claudine, I had to tell him. He's like a nephew to me. I can't be part of something like this." He said my request to investigate Brittany was inappropriate and confirmed the concerning pattern Daniel had described. He'd decided he couldn't help me. After they hung up, I sat in my living room in the dark. Another betrayal. Another person I'd trusted had chosen Brittany's narrative over me. Even Gerald's best friend, who'd known me for over 40 years, believed I was the problem. An hour later, Daniel came to my house. I hadn't expected him. When I opened the door, the anger on his face scared me. He pushed past me into my living room and started yelling. He said I was obsessed with destroying his happiness, that I couldn't stand to see him independent and in love, that I was bitter and alone and wanted him to be miserable too. Then he said something that stopped my heart. "Brittany told me you'd do this. She warned me 6 months ago that you'd try to sabotage our relationship. She said controlling mothers can't let go." She was right about everything. 6 months ago, before the engagement, before any of this started, Brittany had predicted my every move, had laid the groundwork so far in advance that Daniel was primed to interpret everything I did as manipulation. This wasn't reactive. This was planned, methodical, expert. Daniel delivered his ultimatum at my doorstep. "Stay away from the wedding. Stay away from the cabin. If you show up, I'll have you removed by police. After the wedding, we'll discuss you signing the cabin over properly. Brittany's attorney says we have a strong case for adverse possession and inheritance rights. If you fight us, you'll lose me forever." Then he left. Just turned and walked out, leaving me standing in my doorway. I went to bed that night, feeling more alone than I'd ever felt, even when Gerald died. At least then, I'd had Daniel. I'd had family and community. Now I had nothing. I'd lost my savings. My family had turned against me. My church thought I was unstable. My late husband's best friend had betrayed me. Legal threats hung over my head. I was about to lose the cabin, the place that held 40 years of memories. And worst of all, my son believed I was a villain. Every attempt I'd made to fix things had made them worse. Every step I'd taken had been predicted and used against me. I was completely defeated. But at 11:47 that night, an email arrived. The sender address was just a string of random numbers and letters. The subject line said, "You need to know the truth about Brittany." The message was short. "I know what she's doing to you. This isn't the first time. My brother lost everything. His mother died of a broken heart. I can prove it. Please meet me. I'll explain everything." The email was signed with just a name. Ruth. I stared at that email for an hour before responding. It could be a trap. Brittany could have sent it, trying to catch me doing something she could use against me. But something in the message felt genuine, desperate, like someone who'd seen this happen before. I wrote back, keeping my message brief. "Who are you? How do you know Brittany?" The response came 10 minutes later. "I'm Ruth Patterson. Brittany was married to my brother Edward 6 years ago. Same pattern, same manipulation. Our mother lost everything. I've been tracking Brittany. I know what she's doing to your family. We arranged to meet at a diner, 2 towns over, a place where no one would recognize us. I drove there the next morning, my hands gripping the steering wheel too tightly, my mind racing with possibilities. Ruth was waiting in a back booth. She was about 55, with tired eyes and graying hair pulled back in a ponytail. When she saw me, she stood up and hugged me like we were old friends. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. "I wish I'd found you sooner." We sat down, and Ruth pulled out a thick folder. Inside were documents, photos, printouts of emails, and text messages. She spread them across the table like evidence at a trial. Her story was chilling. 6 years ago, her brother Edward had met a woman named Brittany Carson at a conference. Edward was 42, had never been married, was close to his mother. His father had died 10 years earlier, leaving their mother Helen as a widow with a paid-off house in a nice suburb and some retirement savings. Brittany pursued Edward aggressively. Within months, they were engaged, and that's when things started to change. Ruth described exactly what had happened to me. Brittany began finding fault with Edward's mother. She claimed his mother was controlling, manipulative, didn't approve of her. She documented incidents, twisted normal interactions into evidence of toxicity. She slowly isolated Edward from his mother and the rest of the family. The wedding happened at Edward's childhood home. Within a year of the marriage, Brittany and Edward had moved in with his mother, claiming they needed to save money. But, once they were living there, Brittany made the mother's life miserable. Criticized everything, made her feel unwelcome in her own home. Eventually, they convinced the mother to move into an assisted living facility, that she couldn't manage the house anymore, that she needed care. The mother died 2 years later. The death certificate said heart failure, but Ruth believed it was a broken heart. Her mother had given up, had lost the will to live, after being pushed out of her home and away from her son. After the mother died, Edward inherited the house. But the marriage fell apart quickly. Brittany filed for divorce within months. In the settlement, she got half the value of the house, over $300,000. Ruth showed me the divorce papers, showed me emails where Brittany had written to friends about her strategy, about how she'd invested time in the relationship and deserved compensation. Showed me a pattern of calculated manipulation. But there was more. Ruth had done research. She'd found another man before Edward. Another relationship with a 40-something never-married man whose widowed mother owned property. That relationship hadn't made it to marriage, but the pattern was identical. Brittany had tried to isolate him from his mother, had tried to gain access to family property. Brittany was running a long con. She targeted men in their early to mid-40s who'd never been married or were divorced. Men who were close to their mothers. Men whose mothers were widows with property or assets. She was patient, methodical. She'd invest 2 or 3 years in a relationship, manipulate the man into believing his mother was the problem, position herself to access the family assets, then cash out and move on. Ruth pulled out more documents. She'd been tracking Brittany for 2 years, ever since her brother's divorce. She'd found the pattern, found the previous victims, documented everything. She'd been trying to find Brittany's next target to warn them. And then she'd seen the wedding announcement in a local paper. Daniel Hartwell and Brittany Carson. Ruth had done research and found me. Found the cabin, realized exactly what was happening. "Why didn't you contact me sooner?" I asked. Ruth's eyes filled with tears. "I tried. I sent you a message on social media 3 months ago. You never responded. I realized later that Brittany must have gotten to you first, must have isolated you so completely that you weren't checking messages from strangers. I thought about my social media accounts. I'd stopped checking them weeks ago, because every time I logged in, I saw Brittany's posts, saw people supporting her, saw evidence of how thoroughly she'd turned everyone against me." Ruth pushed the folder toward me. "This is all yours. Copies of everything. Marriage certificates, divorce papers, court documents, emails. Proof that Brittany has done this before. Proof that this is a pattern, not a coincidence." I looked at the evidence spread across the table. Here was the truth. Here was proof that I wasn't crazy, wasn't the problem, wasn't imagining things. Brittany was a con artist, and Daniel was her mark. But then reality set in. What could I do with this information? Daniel wouldn't believe me. He'd been so thoroughly manipulated that showing him this evidence would just seem like another desperate attempt to sabotage his happiness. Brittany had predicted everything I would do. She'd probably predicted this too. I talked through my options with Ruth and my attorney Martin, who I called from the diner. Martin reviewed the documents and confirmed they were legitimate. But he gave me hard advice. If you confront Daniel with this now, 2 weeks before the wedding, he won't believe you. He'll think you fabricated it or hired actors or found some elaborate way to lie. Brittany has poisoned him too thoroughly. You'll lose any remaining chance at a relationship with him. Martin suggested I stay silent until after the wedding. Let Daniel marry her. Then, in a few months when things settled down, present the evidence. At least then, Daniel could divorce her. It would be expensive and painful, but not as devastating as a public confrontation. But I couldn't accept that. I couldn't let the wedding happen at the cabin. Couldn't watch Brittany claim ownership of my family's home. Couldn't stand by while she celebrated her victory. I made a decision that I knew was risky, maybe even disastrous. I would go to the wedding uninvited. I would bring the evidence. I would expose Brittany publicly before the vows were exchanged. I would give Daniel one last chance to see the truth. I knew this might destroy my relationship with Daniel forever. Knew he might never forgive me for humiliating him in front of his guests. Knew Brittany had probably planned for this exact scenario and had a counter-strategy ready. But I couldn't stay silent. I couldn't let her win without a fight. Ruth agreed to attend the wedding with me as a witness. Martin reluctantly agreed to be there as well, to provide legal credibility to the documents. We spent the next week preparing. I made copies of all the evidence, organized it carefully, wrote out exactly what I would say. I practiced in front of my mirror, trying to stay calm and factual, trying not to sound like the crazy mother-in-law Brittany had painted me as. The night before the wedding, I drove to the cabin. I parked at a neighboring property and walked through the woods, wanting to see the final preparations. The cabin looked beautiful. White chairs were set up on the lawn, overlooking the lake. String lights were hung between trees. Everything was perfect. I watched from the tree line as Daniel and Brittany walked around, checking details. I saw Daniel laugh at something she said. Saw him put his arm around her. He looked happy, genuinely happy. And for a moment, I faltered. Maybe Martin was right. Maybe I should let him be happy, even if it was based on lies. Maybe love was enough, even if the foundation was manipulation. But then I saw Brittany talking to the caterer, pointing at the photos on the cabin walls. Photos of our family, of Daniel growing up, of Gerald and me, and summers by the lake. I couldn't hear what she was saying, but I saw her gesture dismissively. Saw the caterer nod and start taking photos down. Brittany was erasing me from the cabin's history already. Before the wedding even happened, she was removing evidence I'd ever existed here. My resolve hardened. This wasn't just about Daniel anymore. This was about my home, my memories, my history. This was about 40 years of love and work and family. I wouldn't let her erase that without a fight. I walked back through the woods toward my car. The sun had set completely, and I was navigating by moonlight and memory. I'd walked these woods 1,000 times over 40 years. I knew every path, but I was tired and emotional and not paying attention. My foot caught on an exposed tree root. I fell hard, my head hitting a rock on the ground. Pain exploded through my skull. My phone flew out of my hand, landing somewhere in the darkness. I tried to stand but couldn't. My ankle was screaming in pain, and the world was spinning. I called out, but my voice was weak. The wedding venue was too far away. No one could hear me. I lay there in the dark woods, trying to stay conscious. I could hear music in the distance. Wedding guests arriving. Laughter and conversation. Life going on while I lay bleeding in the forest. Hours passed. I drifted in and out of consciousness. At some point I heard barking. A dog. Then voices. Lights. Someone had found me. It was my neighbor from the next property over. His dog had wandered into the woods and found me. He called an ambulance. I remember the paramedics, the questions, the lights, then nothing. I woke up in the hospital. A nurse told me I had a concussion, a badly sprained ankle, and bruised ribs. I'd been unconscious for several hours in the woods. They'd called my emergency contact. Daniel appeared in my hospital room the next morning. It was his wedding day. He was wearing a suit. He should have been getting ready for the ceremony. But instead of concern, his face showed fury. You were spying on us? You were hiding in the woods watching the wedding preparations? Even after everything, you couldn't stop? I tried to explain. Tried to tell him about Brittany's past, about Ruth and Edward, about the evidence. But he wouldn't listen. He cut me off, his voice hard and final. This is it. We're done. Don't contact me again. Ever. I'm having the hospital remove you as my emergency contact. I'm getting a restraining order if you come near us again. He left. Walked out of the hospital room without looking back. Left me there, injured and alone, and went back to the cabin to marry Brittany. I'd lost. Completely. The wedding would happen without me stopping it. All my evidence was meaningless, still in my car in a parking lot 2 miles away. Daniel had cut all ties. I was injured and isolated. My decision to fight had made everything worse. My solution had created the worst crisis yet. I'd reached absolute rock bottom. The hospital discharged me 2 days later. I took a taxi home because I couldn't drive with my sprained ankle. My house felt empty and cold. I'd never felt more alone in my life. For 2 weeks, I did nothing. I couldn't. My body needed to heal, and my spirit was broken. I replayed everything over and over in my mind. Every decision, every mistake, every moment where I could have done something differently. I wondered if maybe everyone was right. Maybe I was the problem. Maybe I was too controlling, too unable to let go. Maybe Brittany was just a woman who wanted to marry the man she loved, and I'd turned her into a villain in my head. The doubt was crushing. I'd been so certain of the truth, so sure Brittany was manipulating everyone. But what if I was wrong? What if my grief and loneliness had twisted my perception? What if I'd destroyed my relationship with my son over nothing? One afternoon, about 3 weeks after the wedding, I forced myself to start going through Gerald's papers. I'd been avoiding them for 8 years, keeping everything in boxes in the spare room closet. It hurt too much to look at his handwriting, his notes, the detritus of his life. But I needed something to do. Something to occupy my mind and hands while my body healed. So I pulled out the boxes and started sorting. Most of it was mundane. Old bills, tax returns, warranty information for appliances long since replaced. But then I found a folder labeled Cabin in Gerald's careful block print. Inside were documents I hadn't seen in decades. The property deed from 1985. The mortgage papers. Construction permits. A survey of the land. I spread them out on my kitchen table and started reading carefully. Really reading them for the first time since Gerald died. The property had been purchased on June 15, 1985, for $62,000. The down payment was $15,000. The mortgage was for $47,000, financed over 20 years. I'd known all of that, but as I read more carefully, I started seeing details I'd forgotten or never fully understood. The property deed listed 3 names as owners: Gerald Hartwell, Claudine Hartwell, and Iris Hartwell. Gerald's mother, Iris, had provided the down payment. But instead of just giving us the money, she'd made herself a co-owner of the property. The deed specified tenants in common with right of survivorship. I'd forgotten about that. Or maybe I'd never really understood what it meant. At the time, I'd been 24 years old with a baby. Legal terms had seemed irrelevant. Gerald's mother was helping us. We were grateful. The details didn't matter. But now I looked up the terms. Tenants in common meant we each owned a share. Right of survivorship meant when one owner died, their share automatically transferred to the remaining owners. Iris had died in 1998, 17 years after we bought the cabin. I remembered her funeral, Daniel crying for his grandmother. But I didn't remember anything about property transfers or legal changes. It had just been understood that Gerald and I owned the cabin now. When Gerald died in 2017, his share transferred to me, the only surviving owner, which meant I owned the cabin completely. 100%. Had owned it fully for 8 years. I sat back, trying to understand what this meant. Daniel had no legal claim to the cabin. He'd never been on the deed. He'd never owned any part of it. Everything Brittany had based her plan on was wrong. But why the confusion? I dug deeper in the folder and found Gerald's will. I'd read it when he died, of course, but I'd been too grief-stricken to focus on details. Now, I read it carefully. The will mentioned the cabin. It said something about all property, including the family cabin, to pass according to legal ownership and established agreements. That phrase was vague. I could see how someone might misinterpret it as the cabin being part of Gerald's estate, passing to his heirs. But because of the right of survivorship clause, the cabin hadn't been part of Gerald's estate. It couldn't be. It had already belonged to me. Daniel must have read the will, seen the cabin mentioned, and assumed he would inherit it someday. Brittany must have seen the same thing. They'd built their entire plan on a misunderstanding. I kept digging through the folder. At the bottom was an envelope I'd never seen before. It was yellowed with age, the seal broken. Inside was a letter, written in Iris's elegant cursive handwriting. It was dated June 20th, 1985, 5 days after we'd bought the cabin. The letter was addressed to Gerald. As I read it, tears began streaming down my face. Iris explained why she'd structured the ownership the way she did. She wrote about her own experiences as a widow. Gerald's father had died when Gerald was 12, leaving Iris with very little. Everything had been in her husband's name. She'd had to fight for years just to keep their house. She'd learned the hard way that women needed protection. She wrote that she wanted to make sure I was protected specifically. She loved her son, but she knew life was unpredictable. If anything happened to Gerald, she wanted to ensure I wouldn't lose the cabin. The structure she'd created meant I would always be an owner, would always have rights to the property, would never be dependent on anyone else's goodwill. The letter ended with a request. She asked Gerald to promise never to change the ownership structure without her permission. She made him promise to protect me the way she wished her own husband had protected her. Gerald had kept his promise. He'd never changed the deed. He'd never removed me as an owner. Even though the cabin was often called the family cabin or talked about as Daniel's eventual inheritance, Gerald had made sure the legal reality protected me. Iris's letter ended with one more line that hit me like a punch. "Your father left me nothing," she wrote. "I won't let that happen to Claudine." I sat at my kitchen table, holding that letter, crying for the mother-in-law I'd lost over 25 years ago. She'd thought ahead. She'd protected me from something she couldn't have foreseen, and I'd forgotten. I'd let myself be bullied and gaslit and accused because I'd forgotten the gift she'd given me. The cabin was mine. Legally, completely, undeniably mine. All of Brittany's lawyer threats were meaningless. The adverse possession claims, the inheritance arguments, all of it was based on false assumptions. I owned the cabin. I held all the power. I'd just been too beaten down to realize it. For the first time in months, I felt something other than despair. I felt anger. Real, righteous anger. Not the helpless frustration I'd been feeling, but actual fury at what had been done to me. Daniel and Brittany had spent months terrorizing me. They'd stolen my money, destroyed my reputation, isolated me from everyone I loved, and threatened me legally. They'd made me question my own sanity. They'd abandoned me injured in a hospital, all because they wanted something that was already mine. And now they were on their honeymoon, probably celebrating their victory, probably planning how they'd move into the cabin and start their new life in my home. The anger was clarifying. It burned away the doubt and self-blame. I wasn't the problem. I hadn't been wrong. I'd been right all along, and I'd let myself be convinced otherwise. 3 days later, I received an email from Gregory Walsh, Brittany's attorney. The message was short and businesslike. His clients were returning from their honeymoon in 1 week. They expected to move into the cabin immediately. They requested all my personal belongings be removed before their arrival. They would be changing the locks. If I had any items remaining after move-in date, they would be considered abandoned property. That evening, Daniel called. It was the first time I'd heard from him since the hospital. His voice was cold and businesslike. No greeting, no asking how I was healing. Just, "We need to settle the cabin situation." He said they'd been generous, letting me keep my things there during the honeymoon. Their attorney was prepared to file adverse possession claims if I didn't cooperate. They didn't want to make this harder than it had to be. I listened to him talk, this stranger with my son's voice. When he finished, I said calmly, "Come to the cabin this Saturday. Bring Brittany. We'll settle this." Daniel sounded surprised. "Finally," he said. "Thank you for being reasonable. We'll bring our attorney too." "Bring whoever you want," I said, and hung up. For the first time in months, I smiled. A real smile. Because I knew something they didn't. I held the truth. I held the power. And I was done being a victim. I called Martin and told him everything. Showed him the documents, Iris's letter, the deed. His eyes got wider with each page. "Claudine, you own this property free and clear. You always have. They have no case at all." I told him my plan for Saturday. He was concerned but agreed to attend. I also called Ruth and asked if she and Edward could come. Ruth agreed immediately. She said Edward wanted to meet Daniel, to warn him about what he'd gotten himself into, to help if he could. Friday night, I drove to the cabin. My ankle was mostly healed, just a little tender. I let myself in with my key, walked through the rooms that held 40 years of memories. Brittany had already made changes. The photos I'd seen her removing were gone. New furniture had been brought in. My favorite reading chair was gone. The quilt Iris had made, the one that always hung over the back of the couch, had been removed. My books were packed in boxes in the corner, ready to be thrown out. Brittany was erasing me, systematically removing every trace I'd ever existed here. I didn't remove anything. Instead, I set up the dining room for a meeting. I placed my laptop on the table. I arranged all the documents in folders, labeled and organized. The property deed, Iris's letter, tax records, mortgage payments, everything that proved ownership. Ruth's folder with evidence of Brittany's past, marriage certificates, divorce papers, Edward's testimony, everything that proved the con. I was ready. Ready to take everything back. Ready to stop being a victim and start being a fighter. Ready to reveal the truth that had been hidden for 40 years, the truth that Iris had created to protect me. Tomorrow, Daniel would learn that his mother wasn't the villain Brittany had painted. And Brittany would learn that her entire scheme had been built on false assumptions. Tomorrow, the truth would come out. And I would win. Saturday morning arrived clear and beautiful. I got to the cabin early, went through everything one more time. Ruth and Edward arrived first. Edward was a quiet man in his late 40s with kind eyes and nervous hands. He hugged me when he arrived. "I'm sorry," he said. "I'm so sorry she did this to your family too." Martin arrived next, carrying his briefcase. He reviewed the documents one more time, nodded his approval. At 10 o'clock, exactly, we heard car doors slam. Daniel, Brittany, and their attorney Gregory walked in. They entered the cabin like they owned it, like I was the intruder. Brittany was carrying a champagne flute. She'd been drinking on the drive, celebrating what she thought was her victory. She wore designer sunglasses and a smug expression. Daniel looked uncomfortable, but determined. Gregory carried a leather briefcase and wore an expensive suit. They stopped short when they saw Ruth and Edward. Who are these people? Daniel asked. I gestured to the dining room table. Why don't we all sit down? We took our places. Brittany set her champagne glass on the table with a careless clink. Gregory opened his briefcase. This won't take long, he said. My clients are prepared to offer compensation for any improvements you made to the property, contingent on immediate transfer of occupancy and eventual title. I held up one hand. Before we begin, there are some people Daniel should meet. I nodded to Ruth and Edward. Ruth spoke first. She introduced herself and Edward. Told Daniel that Brittany had been married to Edward 6 years ago. Daniel's head whipped toward Brittany. You said you'd never been married. Brittany's face went pale. She stammered, This is insane. I don't know these people. You hired actors? Ruth slid the marriage certificate across the table. Then divorce papers. Then photos of Brittany and Edward at their wedding, at Edward's mother's house, at family gatherings. Edward spoke then. Told his story in a quiet, pained voice. How Brittany had isolated him from his mother. How she'd convinced him his mother was toxic and controlling. How they'd moved into his mother's house. How his mother had died, broken-hearted in a nursing home. How Brittany had taken half the value of the house in the divorce settlement. I watched Daniel's face as he listened. Watched recognition dawn, then horror, then doubt. He turned to Brittany. Tell me this isn't true. Brittany was crying now, mascara running. It was different with them. You're different. I love you. I placed more documents on the table. Evidence of another man before Edward. Same pattern. Same manipulation tactics. Timeline showing how Brittany had been doing this for over a decade. How she targeted men in their 40s with never-married status and widowed mothers who owned property. Daniel was reading the documents, his face getting paler. He looked at Brittany like he'd never seen her before. You used me. To get the cabin. Brittany tried to recover. No, baby, I'm just upset. These people are trying to confuse you. The cabin is yours. We deserve it. Your mother has been keeping it from you. Gregory cleared his throat uncomfortably. I actually think I should step outside. No, I said firmly. Stay. You need to hear this too. Brittany stood up, grabbed her champagne glass. This is ridiculous. The cabin is Daniel's inheritance. You can't keep us from what's rightfully his. She took a defiant sip of champagne, her hand shaking. I placed the final folder on the table. This one contained the property deed, Iris's letter, and all the ownership documents. Daniel, I said quietly, you've spent these months believing you inherited this cabin from your father. Brittany convinced you I was keeping you from your birthright. But here's what neither of you knew. I walked him through the documents slowly, showed him the original deed with 3 names, explained tenants in common and right of survivorship, showed him when Iris died and how the property transferred, showed him when Gerald died and how it transferred again. I have owned this cabin completely for 8 years. Your father owned half of it for 12 years, then nothing. There was never any inheritance for you, because the property was never in his estate. The room went silent. Brittany's face cycled through emotions. Disbelief, understanding, then pure rage. She slammed her champagne glass down on the table. The glass shattered, sending champagne and crystal shards across the surface. That's impossible, she screamed. The will mentioned the cabin. Martin spoke up, his lawyer voice calm and authoritative. The will mentioned it, yes, but couldn't transfer it. Gerald didn't own it to transfer. It already belonged entirely to Claudine through right of survivorship. You can't do this, Brittany was shouting now, all pretense of the sweet fiancée gone. We're married. Daniel has rights. Daniel has the right to visit his mother's cabin, I said calmly, when he's invited. Then Brittany revealed her true nature. All the manipulation, all the careful playing of roles disappeared. You stupid old woman. That cabin is worth $1 million. You think I wasted 2 years on your boring son for nothing? Daniel heard it, really heard it. The confession he needed. He stared at her like she was a stranger. You used me, he whispered, To get the cabin. Brittany tried to walk it back, but the damage was done. Gregory stood up, closed his briefcase. "I'm done here," he said, and walked out. Daniel sat frozen, staring at the shattered champagne glass on the table. The pieces of crystal looked like his illusions, broken and scattered. "Mom," he said finally, "what have I done?" I pulled out Iris's letter, the one she'd written 40 years ago. I read it aloud. Every word about protecting me, about women needing to look out for each other, about not letting me be left with nothing the way she'd been left with nothing. Your grandmother Iris protected me 40 years ago from something she couldn't foresee. Your father honored that protection his entire life. I kept that trust, because I believed you would understand that family means more than property. I looked at Daniel. "You're my son. I love you. That hasn't changed, but you abandoned me. You believed the worst of me. You left me injured and alone. Brittany may have manipulated you, but you chose to believe her. You chose cruelty over conversation. Those were your choices." Then I turned to Brittany. "You need to leave. Now. You have 10 minutes to get off this property before I call the police for trespassing." Brittany looked at Daniel desperately. "Daniel, tell her we're married. This is our home now." Daniel spoke quietly. "No, it's not. It never was." Brittany's face twisted with rage. She grabbed her purse, knocked over her chair. She screamed threats as she stormed out, but they were empty threats now. We all knew it. We heard her car start, heard her tires spin in the gravel as she drove away. The cabin was silent. Ruth, Edward, and Martin quietly stepped outside to give us privacy. Daniel and I sat across from each other at the table, shattered glass between us. He broke down, started crying. Really crying. "I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I didn't rush to comfort him. I let him feel it. "Sorry isn't enough," I said. "But it's a start." We talked for 2 hours. Daniel explained how Brittany had gotten into his head, how she'd made him see everything through her lens, how she'd exploited his guilt about not getting married earlier, about not giving me grandchildren, how she'd twisted every normal mother-son interaction into evidence of my supposed control. He'd wanted to believe he was breaking free from an overbearing mother, he admitted. It made him feel independent and strong. Brittany had given him permission to be cruel by convincing him it was self-care. I listened. Let him talk through it all. Then I said something he needed to hear. She was good at what she did. Professional, even. But Daniel, you have to understand, the manipulation worked because part of you wanted it to. You wanted to believe you were a victim. It gave you permission to treat me badly. That's what you need to examine in yourself. Daniel nodded, accepting it. "Can you forgive me?" "Eventually," I said. "Not today, maybe not for a long time, but eventually." I told him what he needed to do. File for annulment. Fraud is grounds. Get therapy. Real therapy, not just for a few sessions. Make amends to everyone he'd turned against me. The extended family, the church community, everyone who'd believed his version of events. "And the cabin?" he asked quietly. "It's yours. It always was. I was so entitled, so wrong." I pulled out another folder. This one contained a document Martin had helped me draft. "It's a family trust," I explained. "The cabin goes into a trust. I have lifetime occupancy and complete control. After I die, it goes to you, but only under certain conditions." I read him the conditions. He had to maintain a relationship with me. He had to use the cabin for family, not profit. If he ever tried to sell it, everything would go to charity instead, honoring Iris's original intent to protect family. "I don't deserve this," Daniel said. "No, you don't. But family isn't about deserving. It's about love. And despite everything, I still love you." We didn't hug, not yet. But we walked out to the porch together and sat looking at the lake. The same view we'd looked at for 40 summers. The same water, the same sky, the same peace. "We have a lot of healing to do," I said. "I'll do whatever it takes," Daniel promised. "It might take years. I've got time." Ruth and Edward came back to say goodbye. Edward hugged Daniel. "Learn from my mistakes," he said. "Don't wait years to see the truth. Get help now. Leave her now." After they left, Daniel asked, "What happens now?" "Now we start over. Slowly, carefully, honestly. And you figure out who you are without someone telling you." I stood up to go back inside. Turned back to him. "Oh, and Daniel? You're paying back that $12,000. For the first time in months, he laughed. A real laugh. "Yes, ma'am." I walked through the cabin, my protection, my legacy. I took down the frame that held an old family photo and replaced it with Iris's letter, carefully protected behind glass. I hung it on the wall next to the photos Brittany had removed, which I put back in their rightful places. The family history was restored. The truth was revealed. The 40-year secret had finally been spoken. I realized something profound as I stood there. Iris had taught me something 40 years ago that I'd forgotten. Women have to protect themselves and each other, not through control or manipulation, but through truth. Through legal protection and clear boundaries and refusing to be erased. The cabin was never really about property. It was about protection. Protection from people who see relationships as transactions. Protection from being forgotten and erased. Protection from being left with nothing. That's what Iris gave me. And in a way, that's what I gave Daniel today. Not the cabin itself, but the truth. Even when it hurt. Especially when it hurt. I thought about everything I'd been through. The isolation, the financial attack, the betrayal, the injury. I'd been pushed to rock bottom. I'd questioned my own sanity. I'd almost given up. But Iris's 40-year-old gift had saved me. Her foresight, her protection, her understanding that women need safeguards in a world that doesn't always value them. And now I stood in the cabin that was fully, legally, undeniably mine. Not because I'd fought for it in court, not because I'd manipulated or schemed, but because a woman I loved had loved me back, had thought ahead, had protected me from a future she couldn't predict. The sun was setting over the lake, painting the water gold and pink. Daniel sat on the porch, making phone calls. I heard him talking to a therapist's office, scheduling an appointment. Heard him calling his attorney about annulment procedures. Heard him leaving a voicemail for Patricia, his aunt, asking to talk. The healing had begun. It would be slow. Trust, once shattered like that champagne glass, couldn't be pieced back together overnight. But we could start. We could try. I was alone in the cabin, but I wasn't lonely. I was hurt, but I was healing. And most importantly, I had won. Not through revenge, not through bitterness, but through truth. Through standing firm in reality, when everyone tried to convince me I was wrong. Through refusing to be erased. That's the most satisfying victory of all. I learned something through this nightmare. I learned that sometimes the greatest act of love is standing firm in your truth, even when everyone tells you you're wrong. I learned that protecting yourself isn't selfish, it's necessary. I learned that family can be rebuilt, but only on a foundation of honesty. And I learned that sometimes the gifts our loved ones give us don't reveal their true value for decades. Iris gave me the cabin 40 years ago, but what she really gave me was protection, dignity, and the power to stand firm when everything else was falling apart. That's a gift worth more than any property. That's a legacy worth protecting. As I watched the sun set over the lake, over my cabin, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. Real, deep, lasting peace. And gratitude. To Iris, who'd seen the future clearly enough to protect me. To Gerald, who'd honored his mother's wishes. To Ruth, who'd had the courage to warn a stranger. To Martin, who'd stood by me. And even to Daniel, who'd finally chosen truth over comfortable lies. The 40-year secret was out. And the truth, as painful as it was, had set us all free. Now I want to ask you something. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to make you doubt your own reality? Where you had to stand firm in your truth even when everyone said you were wrong? How did you find the strength to keep going? Share your story in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else who's going through something similar. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button. It helps others find these stories when they need them most. And subscribe to this channel for more stories about real people facing real challenges and finding the strength to overcome them. Share this video with someone who might need to hear it, someone who's struggling to stand firm in their truth. Thank you for listening to my story. Thank you for witnessing my journey from victim to survivor to victor. I hope it reminds you that you're stronger than you think, that truth matters, and that the people who truly love us often protect us in ways we don't understand until we need it most. Take care of yourselves, protect yourselves, and remember, family built on truth is always stronger than family built on comfortable lies. Until next time.